The night was always the same for Ethan. A series of deliveries under the muted hum of streetlights and the occasional flicker of neon signs in the distance. His car, a battered hatchback with a perpetually flickering check engine light, had seen better days, but it was reliable enough to navigate the lonely stretches of suburban streets. Ethan's nights were long, a repetitive loop of pickups and drop-offs. The GPS was his lifeline, charting paths through darkened neighborhoods and weaving him through silent highways. Most of his clients were unremarkable, a mix of insomniacs, workaholics, or late-night snackers who barely acknowledged him. Still, the job paid enough to keep him afloat, and he found comfort in the anonymity of it all. Tonight started no differently. He had been driving for hours, ticking off deliveries one by one. The cool glow of his phone screen illuminated the next stop, a location at the edge of town, just outside the map's usual coverage. The address was strange. Evergreen Lane, House 49. Ethan frowned. He didn't remember a street like that in this area, but the GPS marked a clear path, and the app showed it as his final delivery of the night. He tapped Start Route and followed the instructions. The closer he got, the more the surroundings shifted. The bright, uniform houses faded into sprawling lots and patches of woods. Streetlights grew sparse, and the pavement turned rough, cracked by tree roots and years of neglect. When he turned onto Evergreen Lane, a chill ran down his spine. The street was barely a road, more like a gravel path swallowed by overgrown trees. His headlights cast long, jagged shadows that danced with every bump of the car. At the end of the lane stood a house, its silhouette jagged against the pale moonlight. House 49 was barely standing. Its paint was chipped, shutters hung at odd angles, and the front porch sagged as if it might collapse at any moment. There were no lights, no movement, no sign of life. Ethan checked the app again to confirm he was in the right place. Drop package at the door, the instructions read. It was a standard no-contact delivery. Ethan grabbed the small box from the passenger seat. It was light but oddly cold to the touch, wrapped in plain brown paper with no markings except a scrawled, faded 49. As he approached the house, his boots crunched on the gravel, the sound unnervingly loud in the silence. He set the box on the creaking porch, snapped a quick photo for confirmation, and turned back toward his car. The night felt heavier now, the air thick and still. Sliding into the driver's seat, he started the engine, eager to leave. But as he pulled out his phone to mark the delivery complete, a notification flashed across the screen. "Thank you for bringing the last piece." The words lingered on the screen, stark against the dark. Ethan's stomach twisted. It wasn't just the message, it was the timestamp. It had been sent the moment he placed the box on the porch. He looked back at the house, its dark windows staring at him like empty eyes. His instinct screamed at him to drive away, but the words gnawed at his mind. This wasn't normal. Something was wrong. The gravel crunched beneath the tires as Ethan turned the car around, putting the strange house behind him. He kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see movement in the shadows. The message on his phone replayed in his mind, unsettling in its precision. The last piece. It sounded more like a conclusion than a simple confirmation. The dark, narrow road stretched ahead, bordered by gnarled trees that leaned in as though trying to swallow the path whole. The faint hum of the engine was the only sound in the oppressive quiet. Ethan tightened his grip on the wheel, trying to focus on the road instead of the unease clawing at the edges of his thoughts. He told himself it didn't matter. People left odd instructions all the time. But this felt different. Something about the house, the timing of the message, the isolation of the area. It all felt wrong. The app's route cleared as soon as he marked the delivery complete, leaving him without a map back to familiar roads. As he drove, his surroundings became increasingly disorienting. The dense trees and uneven terrain made it feel like he was going in circles, even though he was certain he hadn't turned back. The headlights flickered momentarily, casting the road into darkness before returning with a dull glow. He reached for his phone, hoping to pull up a new route, but the screen refused to load. No signal. The night pressed in tighter, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of unseen creatures in the underbrush. After what felt like an eternity, he finally emerged from the suffocating woods onto a slightly broader road. He exhaled, the tension in his chest loosening just enough to let him breathe. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was later than he'd thought, but the feeling didn't leave him. The unease lingered, amplified by the memory of the message. For a moment, he considered heading straight home, shaking off the night as just another odd encounter on the job. Yet, something about the delivery gnawed at him, a curiosity laced with dread. He thought back to the house, its derelict frame standing alone in the dark. Who lived there? Why did they need that package, and what did they mean by the last piece? Questions piled up in his mind, each one heavier than the last. Despite his better judgment, he found himself circling back toward Evergreen Lane. It was an impulsive decision, driven more by a need for closure than logic. He told himself it would only take a moment, just a quick look to prove nothing was out of the ordinary. The gravel road came into view again, shrouded in the same oppressive stillness. The house loomed at the end, unchanged, as though it had been waiting for his return. This time, as he parked and stepped out of the car, the air felt colder, the silence sharper. He noticed small details he hadn't registered before. A faint, acrid smell in the air, the way the trees around the property seemed to lean inward as if shielding it from view. He walked slowly toward the porch, his flashlight cutting through the dark. The box was no longer where he'd left it. In its place was a faint, dusty outline on the wood, as if it had been there for years. The door creaked open slightly as he stepped closer. Ethan stood frozen, the faint creak of the door lingering in the stillness. The house loomed larger now, its warped frame sagging under years of neglect. The air around it felt heavy, as though something unseen was pressing down. He hesitated on the porch, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. The open door revealed only darkness inside, an inky void that seemed to swallow the light. He didn't want to step inside. Every fiber of his being screamed to leave, but the questions in his mind pulled him forward. He pushed the door gently, and it opened with a groan that echoed unnaturally loud. The air inside was damp and stale, carrying the faint scent of decay. His flashlight illuminated a barren entryway, the walls peeling and streaked with grime. The floorboards creaked under his weight, each step amplifying the oppressive quiet. The room beyond was sparsely furnished, an old chair here, a broken table there, but everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. It looked untouched, as if no one had lived there for decades. Yet, there were signs of recent disturbance. The dust on the floor was marked by faint footprints, too small and uneven to belong to him. Ethan's eyes landed on the box, now sitting on the table in the center of the room. It was unmistakably the same one he had delivered, though the brown paper was now frayed and stained, as though it had aged decades in the span of minutes. His hand hovered over the package, hesitating. He didn't want to touch it, but something about its presence felt accusatory, like it demanded his attention. Finally, he reached out and lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of objects that made his stomach churn. There were photographs, old and faded, showing places he recognized. His childhood home, the school he attended, even the apartment he lived in now. Each picture was impossibly detailed, as if taken from his own memories. Beneath the photos were other items, a key he'd lost years ago, a scrap of fabric from a jacket he thought he'd thrown away, and a bundle of letters addressed to him in handwriting he didn't recognize. He staggered back, nearly dropping the box. The room seemed to close in, the walls pressing tighter, and a low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. His flashlight flickered, plunging the room into brief bursts of light and shadow. Then, he heard it, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from upstairs. The tapping grew louder, deliberate and unnerving, as though someone, or something, was summoning him. Ethan's breath quickened, his grip tightening around the flashlight. His instinct told him to run, to leave the house and never look back, but his legs refused to move. With each creak of the stairs beneath his boots, the sound became clearer. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic, almost mechanical, like a clock counting down. The upstairs hallway was narrow, its walls warped and lined with faded wallpaper peeling at the edges. At the end of the hall, a single door stood ajar, its wood splintered as if it had been forced open. The tapping came from within, punctuating the suffocating silence. Ethan swallowed hard and pushed the door open with his flashlight, revealing a small room lit only by the pale glow of the moon filtering through a cracked window. The room was empty except for a chair positioned in the center, facing away from him. The tapping stopped abruptly as he stepped inside, replaced by an oppressive stillness that seemed to press against his chest. On the chair was something that made his stomach drop, a second package, identical to the first, with his name scrawled across it in bold, jagged letters. The ink looked fresh, as if it had been written moments before. His hands trembled as he picked it up. The package felt heavier than the last, the weight almost unnatural, as though it carried something far greater than its size suggested. He hesitated, glancing around the room as if expecting someone, or something, to be watching. Finally, he opened the package, the paper tearing with an unsettlingly loud sound in the quiet. Inside was an object that froze him in place. A framed photo of himself standing on the porch earlier that night, the box in his hands. But it wasn't just the photo that made his blood run cold. In the background of the image, staring out from the window above the porch, was a face. Pale and featureless, it seemed to gaze directly at him, its expression unreadable but deeply unsettling. Ethan staggered back, the frame slipping from his hands and shattering on the floor. The tapping resumed, this time from somewhere closer, as though whatever had been upstairs was now in the hallway. His breathing quickened as he turned toward the door, his flashlight beam trembling against the shadows. He had to get out now. The walls seemed to groan as he bolted down the stairs, the sound of his footsteps drowned out by the rhythmic pounding that followed, growing louder and faster. He reached the front door and threw it open, stumbling onto the porch. The night air hit him like a wave, cold and sharp, but it didn't bring relief. He looked back toward the house just long enough to see the door slam shut behind him, the sound echoing through the stillness. Ethan ran to his car, his pulse hammering in his ears. The oppressive air of the house seemed to cling to him, making each step feel heavier. He fumbled with his keys, his shaking hands making it nearly impossible to unlock the door. Finally, he wrenched it open and slid into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind him. He turned the key in the ignition, but the engine sputtered, refusing to start. Panic surged as he tried again and again. Each attempt met with the same lifeless response. The tapping sound from the house started again, faint at first, but growing louder, faster, and closer. Ethan's flashlight lay discarded on the passenger seat, its beam illuminating the trees ahead. For a moment, he thought he saw movement among the shadows, figures flitting between the trunks, their shapes too indistinct to make out but unmistakably there. His phone buzzed suddenly, jolting him. Grabbing it, he saw a notification from the delivery app. Delivery complete. Awaiting next assignment. Beneath it was a new address, his home. His breath caught. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. Whatever force had lured him to this place wasn't finished. It had marked him, entwining him in something far beyond his understanding. He turned the key again, desperation overtaking fear. The engine coughed weakly but roared to life on the fourth attempt. Without looking back, Ethan slammed the car into reverse, the tires spitting gravel as he sped away from the house. The road twisted endlessly, the trees crowding closer as if trying to keep him from leaving. His headlights flickered again, plunging him into stretches of near darkness. He checked the rearview mirror instinctively, but what he saw made his stomach drop. The house was no longer in the distance. It was there, looming in the mirror as though it had been following him. Its dark windows seemed alive, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. Ethan looked forward, his hands gripping the wheel tightly. His only focus was escape, the desire to leave this nightmare consuming every thought. The trees began to thin, and a faint light on the horizon hinted at the outskirts of town. Relief surged briefly, until he noticed the package on the passenger seat. It hadn't been there when he left the house. The box sat innocuously, its edges sharp and pristine despite everything else feeling frayed. His name was still scrawled across it, bold and undeniable. Ethan's hands trembled as he reached for it, drawn by equal parts dread and inevitability. This time, he didn't open it. Instead, He rolled down the window and hurled the box into the trees, watching it disappear into the dark. The car's interior grew colder, the air thick with something he couldn't describe. Then, his phone buzzed again. He didn't want to look, but couldn't help himself. "Your package has been returned." Ethan drove on, his mind a storm of fear and confusion. The trees began to blur into streaks of black as he pressed the accelerator harder. The road ahead stretched endlessly, the faint light of town still out of reach. His chest tightened, and the air inside the car felt colder with each passing second. The dashboard clock blinked erratically, its digits warping and shifting, refusing to display the time. His phone buzzed again, the sound sharp and invasive in the quiet car. Against his better judgment, he glanced at the screen. "Proceed to the final stop." The words felt like a command, heavy and inescapable. He wanted to throw the phone away, to reject whatever force was toying with him, but it was no use. He felt trapped, a passenger in his own life, guided by something far beyond his control. Ahead, the road split into two paths. The left led toward the familiar glow of civilization, the promise of safety. The right veered into shadow, a narrow path flanked by towering trees. Ethan's GPS, which had been dead moments before, flickered back to life, its arrow pointing right. His fingers tightened around the wheel as he fought the urge to follow it. He veered left, choosing the light, but the moment his tires touched the path, the car shuddered violently. The engine sputtered and died, the lights flickering out entirely. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan sat frozen, his breath fogging in the icy air. He tried restarting the car, but the key wouldn't turn. The phone buzzed again, the glow of the screen the only light in the suffocating darkness. "You cannot leave." Shaking, Ethan turned his gaze toward the right-hand path. A faint, flickering glow appeared in the distance, like a lantern swaying gently in the breeze. The light was hypnotic, pulling at him with a force he couldn't resist. Leaving the car behind, he stepped onto the path. The ground beneath his feet felt soft, almost yielding, as if it wasn't meant to hold his weight. The trees above seemed to close in, their branches intertwining to block out the sky. The glow grew brighter as he approached, revealing the source, a small, weathered table standing in the middle of the path. On it was the package he had thrown away, pristine and untouched. Ethan's legs felt like lead as he approached. The air around the table pulsed with an unnatural energy, the package seeming to hum with life. He knew he couldn't ignore it this time. With trembling hands, he tore open the box. Inside was a single object, a mirror. Its surface shimmered unnaturally, reflecting not the dim forest around him, but a distorted version of himself. His reflection stared back, but it wasn't him. It moved differently, its expression twisted into something unrecognizable. Then, the figure in the mirror stepped forward. Ethan stumbled back, dropping the mirror. The glass didn't shatter. Instead, it seemed to dissolve into the ground, leaving nothing behind. The forest around him shifted, the trees bending impossibly toward him. And then everything went dark. When Ethan woke, he was sitting in his car, parked outside his apartment. The package was gone, the dashboard clock blinking normally. For a brief moment, he thought it was over, that it had all been some horrible dream. But when he stepped out, he saw it, a new package, waiting on his doorstep. "Your next delivery awaits."